How are you doing? I'm Stefanetta Harmon, here for the Minnesota Spokesman-Recorder. And tonight we are talking the Derek Chauvin Trial. Thank you so much for tuning in. Whether you've been glued to your screens over the past few days or since jury duty selections began, or you've actively avoided these live streams, there's no doubt that this trial has permeated at least some aspect of your conversations over the last few weeks. And we want to talk about it. We're here, nearly through week one of the trial, and we thought it would be helpful to bring on two experts who've been contributing their voices and expert opinions to the Minnesota Spokesman-Recorder over the past few weeks. And so I would love to welcome, here we go, Nekima Levy Armstrong and Mary Moriarty. How are you today?
With everything going on, I'm just glad to be here. Thank you for having us.
Glad to be alive. Thank you so much. And for those who don't know, Nekima Levy Armstrong, she is a civil rights attorney, activist, community organizer. Mary Moriarty, decades as a former Hennepin County. I mean, like, we in this game. I'm decades too. It's
oh, good. Okay. You're making me feel old there for a second.
No, but as a former Hennepin County public defender, you have you have this inside perspective that we really want to talk to and explore over the next, 20, 30 minutes here. Thank you so much. So I would love to just kind of get started even on how we set the stage on how this trial is being viewed in the public, right? As I've been watching it from the outside looking in, it almost feels like the witnesses have been on trial. And I don't know if that's a thing that is just personal to me, or if that's what you're seeing as they're being questioned, and as we're trying to get into, as a prosecution is really trying to set up their case right now against Chauvin and what we're seeing the defense doing. So we'd love to touch on that first. Look, Mary.
Yes, I can understand why this would have the feeling that witnesses are being interrogated. It is a defense lawyer's job to do what's called cross-examination, which means ask questions of the witnesses to try to bring out information that helps their theory of the case. But there are different ways of doing that. Lawyers approach it in a different way. In this particular case, I think the defense lawyers being pretty aggressive and in some ways hostile to the witnesses in a way that I think is making the witnesses defensive. So it's not always effective, which is one of the reasons why I teach trial advocacy, and I talk to students and I talk to young public defenders in particular about, while it is cross-examination, the best way to get information is to show empathy for each witness and respect for each witness, and just to get at the information you want to get and not get in this adversarial position with the witness, because it's really not necessary. But there have been numerous times when that has happened, so I completely understand why people would feel like the witnesses are on trial.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you.
Just piggyback off of what Mary is saying. I believe that the witnesses are on trial because George Floyd is on trial, even though officially this is a murder trial against Derek Chauvin. The defense is focusing specifically on George Floyd's lifestyle, choices that he may have made in order to leave the jury with the impression that George Floyd is somehow responsible for his own death, which is completely absurd. From watching that bystander video and coming to the realization that Derek Chauvin held George Floyd's life literally under his kneecap, which is highly disturbing. It's very traumatizing. And to watch those bystander videos and to hear them over and over again, pleading with the police officers to free George Floyd, to release him from under their knee, and seeing the disdain, the disrespect, even the contempt, that some of the officers seem to have towards the bystanders, and the position that they were placed in. One of the bystander videos from a couple of days ago, when Donald Williams was testifying, and he is the young African-American man with the mixed martial arts background, he was one of the more vocal bystanders, calling out the cops, challenging their behavior. In one of those videos, we can see the aggression that Officer Tao used in terms of telling people to get back, to get on the sidewalk, putting his hand on his pepper spray. One of the other young witnesses talked about Derek Chauvin having his hand on his pepper spray. And that was a very threatening and aggressive gesture on the part of the police towards people who are simply trying to be good Samaritans, who are doing their duty to intervene when they see a serious injustice happening. And so to have the defense attorney take the actions of the bystanders and to try to use that against them and to act as if they're wrong is absolutely unconscionable and despicable. Those bystanders are heroes. And we know that if any of them had physically intervened, they could have ended up dead, period, point blank. And so they're heroes from my perspective. They took a huge risk. It was a holiday. They could have just kept on walking down the street like it was business as usual. But instead, they stopped, they saw what was happening, and they called it out. And that's exactly what we are supposed to do. So I hope people are not being hoodwinked and bamboozled by the defense's strategy of playing on racial stereotypes, talking about, the bystanders were loud, they were a distraction, they called officers names. They did a whole lot better than I would have done if I had been standing on that sidewalk. You would have heard a lot more expletives. You would have, who knows what would have, only God knows, because the average person cannot exercise that level of restraint in a situation like what those bystanders had to witness.
So,
can I piggyback on that?
Yes.
Just because I don't know if it would make people feel any better. It may not, but I don't think the defense strategy is very effective. In fact, he has asked some questions which have blown up in his face. I was thinking of Darnella when he said to her, you posted the video on Facebook and it went viral and it changed your life. And he didn't ask any additional questions. And what was left hanging in the air was somehow she had become a celebrity and she was somehow benefiting from this. And there's a rule kind of in cross-examination that you never ask a question to which you don't know the answer. And clearly he did know the answer to that, because the state then said, hey, Darnella, how has this affected your life? And that's the only reason, that defense question, which he should not have asked, is the only reason that we now know, and everybody's heard that, Darnella talking about praying and apologizing to George Floyd, which obviously it's been extremely traumatic to her. But in terms of trial, it was really devastating to the defense, I think. Mm-hmm. There was another example of that today, actually. In opening statement, the defense was talking about, and it appears one of his theories is that somehow those bystanders interfered with the police ability to care. I think that's a word they used in opening for George Floyd. And that's blown up in their faces too, I think. And today, the analogy he actually used, he was talking to the former supervisor of Chauvin, was, well, if somebody was firing a gun, shooting at you, and there was a medical emergency, what would you do? Wouldn't you protect yourself first? And it was ludicrous. I mean, the idea that, and the state was able to say, were there any bystanders there shooting at anybody? And he said no. So I don't know if it helps people to know. It still shouldn't be asked, and people shouldn't be treated disrespectfully, but it is not going well for the defense. And I think there are a lot of things that are happening in the way he's questioning witnesses that are helpful to the state.
Oh, wow. So that's good to know, because from the outside, we don't have that legal expertise, and we're just like, wait, what? Mm-hmm. How did we get here? And why is this a thing? Or why are you asking these things? And even understanding with the cross-examination part, where you have to discredit the witness, you have to make them not as sympathetic or as unbelievable, but just the idea that you just said that it's not going well. So what did you think it would be like? How far off is this trial from what you expected?
This part of the trial, the first couple of days, was going to go well for the state, because they have these amazing, brave, courageous witnesses getting up there and talking about what they saw, what they did. And frankly, what's been really hard, I think, for everybody, including them, is the trauma that they feel and the guilt that they feel. So that part of the trial was bound to go very well for the state. When you're the defense, you just have to weather that part of it and try not to make mistakes and make it worse for yourself. And so my point there is I think they've made a lot of mistakes that have made it much worse than it needed to be. Because a trial like this is a marathon. It's going to last a month. There's testimony it's going to get much drier, I think. It's going to be about use of force and medical testimony. And so as the defense, you try to weather this and just, get to the stuff about cause of death, because that's really what they want to focus on. So I expected this part to go well, but I think it's going much better than I even thought. The witnesses, especially today, a major victory for the state in that the supervisor of Chauvin said and was allowed to give the opinion that he thought Chauvin used excessive force. And I think that was big. So there have been a lot of things that are going the way of the state that I wouldn't necessarily have expected.
Okay. As we're watching it, and you talked about trauma, right? A lot of us have tuned out because we don't want to be re-traumatized. The opening 9 minutes and 29 seconds, I think was the first time that we've seen it in a year for a lot of folks. Why is it important for us to continue to be engaged in seeing what is happening in the courtroom right now? Nekima?
Well, I think that part of this is about making a conscious choice as far as what level of engagement you can handle, especially for African Americans, because we're already in the midst of trauma from dealing with the economic aspects of a global pandemic, everything that happened in the last year since George Floyd was killed, and trying to figure out our new normal. And now these images, of course, are out there for the world to see every single day during a trial. Sometimes it's multiple videos, sometimes it's pictures. That is a lot to take in for Black people in particular. And so I would urge people to gauge their own level of tolerance and ability to take in the information. And if it's too much, to find another way to use your energy so that you don't get overwhelmed, so that you don't burn out, so that you're not on edge and agitated as a result of what you're seeing. Some people can weather, the coverage. Mary and I are doing it for the sake of being able to, analyze things for people. We want to know what's going on in the courtroom as well. We're champions for justice, but we know that that's not for everybody. I don't want my kids watching the trial, for example, because as young Black people, I just feel as if they have enough that they already have to deal with than to watch, what some could consider to be a spectacle, where a Black man who's dead is essentially on trial for killing himself. I mean, that's what it comes down to, which is really sad.
It's interesting.
I'll add on to that too, that Nekima and I are lawyers. And one thing law school does to you is take away your emotions or maybe make it easier for you to hide them or compartmentalize. So it's not that, and I'm a white woman saying this, I know it's been hard for me. I mean, my mom said today, I can't watch this anymore. This is just too awful. But I just wanted to point out, as lawyers, this is something that we kind of trained to compartmentalize. And I completely agree with Nekima. If you can't watch it, you can't watch it. If you can't watch a part of it, you can't watch a part. I mean, people need to take care of themselves. There's no reason that anybody should have to watch it if they just don't feel, or if they feel like that's going to further traumatize them. I know for some people, it seems to be cathartic and they like watching it. Other people don't. And I think each individual has to make their own decision and not feel compelled as though they have to watch it.
Right. It could trigger, underlying mental health issues that people may be grappling with as well. But I would say for white people in particular and allies who care about racial justice, if you can tolerate it, if you don't have those underlying issues, don't look away, because this is what we have to deal with as Black people in Minneapolis, in the Twin Cities, in the state of Minnesota. We've been trying to get the attention of the powers that be and white allies for many, many years, telling them that the Minneapolis Police Department was out of control, that they have been beating people, that they have been killing people. that they have been over-criminalizing the Black community and getting away with it. And for some reason, the majority of people did not listen until they watched that video on May 25th of 2020 of a Black man being lynched in broad daylight for 9 minutes and 29 seconds. It should not take Black blood being shed, Black lives being lost for white people to wake up and listen and not look away, and to be responsible for helping to push for the changes that we want to see. We are part of a coalition called the Minnesota Justice Coalition. We have 8 bills currently pending at the state legislature that deal with things like ending qualified immunity in the state of Minnesota for police officers, and forcing them to carry their own personal liability insurance, changing the statute of limitations from 3 years to 10 years for families who've lost loved ones to police violence, so they can actually file a lawsuit, once they come out of aspects of the grieving process. The list goes on. And the reality is that most of our state legislators are white. Some are conservative, some are not, but even the ones who claim to be DFL Democrats aren't championing policing bills the way that they should be. And so white allies are the folks who can reason with these people, who can challenge them, who can let them know, you're not going to get my vote or my network's vote or my family's vote if you don't champion these issues. So that's why I'm not going to give white people a pass who don't have underlying mental health or emotional issues and who need to stomach some of the impacts of white supremacy and racism. Because I'm hearing white people say they're exhausted. I'm like, y'all exhausted from watching a trial. Imagine what we go through in this Black skin and having a face being gaslit like on a regular basis, when we're simply saying this is our experience. And it is sometimes like living in a nightmare when you see how systems are oppressing us day in and day out, and people tend to look away, not care, or ignore and undermine Black voices. And Mary and I were part of a conversation yesterday through the Legal Rights Center, and we were talking about this notion of white centering, which is something that has been happening during this trial. As the white female firefighter from Minneapolis was testifying, she had been a bystander, and she was trying to render medical care to Mr. Floyd, but the police, of course, not only didn't allow her to, but they yelled at her and treated her like she didn't matter in that situation. And so as she was testifying, I'm seeing all these comments from white folks saying, oh, she is so amazing. She's the most professional witness. She's the best witness from the state so far. And now this was after Donna Williams had testified, a Black professional MMA fighter who was the most vocal and really probably would have physically, anyway, he could have taken on.
Just bring it back.
Period. Okay. He exercised such a great deal of restraint as a Black man in that situation. This was after Darnella Frazier, who was only 17 years old at the time. She was walking with her cousin to Cup Foods. She got her little 9-year-old cousin safely to the front of the store. And then she walked back and pulled out her camera phone and never let up for all that time to record what was happening to Mr. Floyd, and cried on the stand. So to have people discount their testimony, the 9-year-old Judea bravely saying, this is what I saw, this is what the Chauvin did, it's what happened to George Floyd. No 9-year-old should be in that situation. But what did people do? They censored the white woman and turned her into a hero and put her on a pedestal and acted like what Black people were saying didn't matter as much. And I reject all of that. Black people have to take on an even greater burden, being in a situation like that, putting our lives on the line, knowing that our Blackness is seen as a weapon by too many in law enforcement and too many white people in the general society, and then having to go into a racially hostile courtroom environment and speak your truth when almost everybody else around you is white. So I consider those young Black witnesses and Donna Williams, I consider them to be heroes. I do applaud Genevieve Hanson. I'm glad that she did her part, but she is not to be placed on a pedestal. She didn't do anything different than everybody else. As a matter of fact, she became like a regular bystander. She dropped the B word. She went off on them, to let them know this wasn't right, because her authority as a firefighter was not
was
taken
questioned.
seriously.
Yeah, it was
Exactly.
questioned.
As a woman on the scene in that situation. So I just had to get that off my chest because I just reject white centering, and I want white allies to recognize that and to check themselves and to take in Black people's testimony and embrace it and not undermine it.
That's been the overarching sentiment theme with Minnesota being at ground zero of this is how are we even processing this information that we're receiving on the day-to-day basis? How are we processing not just that 9 minutes, that we thought was 8 minutes, that was 9.5 minutes, and everything that's gone forward since then? It's how do we relens this conversation in a way that not only empowers Black communities, but again, empowers and makes it, I guess, safe, or not even safe, but it creates a lane or a path for white allies to be able to step forward and say, okay, maybe I see how I saw this wrong. And it's not even that it was wrong. It was they saw themselves in her. And that's the difference. So we talk about white centering. At the end of the day, it's they just see themselves in her. So they have empathy. They can't see themselves in this Black man because they don't have that positioning. And so I think that's part of that conversation we're watching and trying to get everybody to see the totality of the case, the courtroom, and the whole entire situation. And Mary, I know you mentioned earlier that, right now this was really setting the stage for the state prosecution, and that you expected things to go well, and that, right now it's a lot of the dramatics, and that later on it will get boring, maybe, per se. What should we be looking for and what should we expect as this moves forward? Because we won't get I don't think that we'll get the bold statements as much anymore. And so what should we be expecting and looking for as bystanders?
I think you're about to see use of force witnesses, but I think the critical piece that's left is really the medical testimony about cause of death, because that's where the defense is claiming that Mr. Floyd died of an accidental overdose. So I think what we should be watching for is how well the state walks. I think they had 8. They have 9 witnesses. They put 8 on a chart in their opening statement, but that didn't include Hennepin County medical examiner Andy Baker. And so they have 9 experts to go through, but Baker's the most important one. And the state really needs to walk him through step by step in non-medical language that all of us can understand why, even though George Floyd had a large amount of fentanyl in his system, that was not the cause of death. That's clearly his opinion. In the opening statement, the defense took some of his statements out of context. And so the state needs to do a good job of walking him and the rest of those witnesses through exactly why what the state is trying to say is just not accurate. I have to run. I'm so sorry.
Well, thank you so much, Mary. We appreciate you hopping on here, and we look forward to hearing from you throughout the coming weeks on your position and anything that you can add to this conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Yes.
Great job.
Thank you. So we just want to thank Mary for being in this conversation. I'm going to drop her. Am I dropping you out, Mary?
Either you are or I am.
I can. Okay. Well, I just want to thank Mary again for tuning in and being able to join in this conversation. If you are reading the Spokesman-Recorder, you will see that she is contributing her thoughts and positions on what's happening in the trial every couple days on the website. So please go to spokesman-recorder.com and check that out. But then also just Nekima, I'm glad that you can stay on. This is how life goes here.
But anything for you. And the Spokesman-Recorder.
For the Spokesman. We do it for the Spokesman.
Which I'm encouraging people, get a subscription. This is the state's only Black woman-owned newspaper, and it's the oldest Black newspaper in the state of Minnesota. So please support the Spokesman. But if you don't mind, let's pick up on this notion of the expert witness testimony, the medical testimony.
Yes, please. What does that look like, especially with the autopsies and
it's going to be very interesting, and some aspects are going to be very technical for people to sit through with all of the medical terminology that they will be using. They will probably also bring in, video, body cam footage from what was happening in the ambulance. I mean, they're probably going to use a lot of different slides and, other props in order to help tell the story of what the medical professionals think will happen. And I think that the defense is really going to do their best to poke holes in the medical expert witnesses' testimony, especially because, again, the defense is saying, hey, the knee on George Floyd's neck didn't kill him. It was really the fact that he had a fatal level of fentanyl in his system, as well as methamphetamines, et cetera. But we all know that had Derek Chauvin not been on the scene that day,
he would still be alive.
George Floyd would still be living his best life, doing what he needed to do. So it's absurd, but I know that they have to defend the case. But one thing that's interesting that happened today is that we heard from a couple of paramedics who showed up on the scene. And I was struck by how they talked about what happened when they came upon the scene. If you think about the bystander video, though, after someone called for an ambulance, what we still saw was George Floyd remaining in handcuffs and Derek Chauvin continuing to press his knee into George Floyd's neck to the point that the ambulance pulls up. Derek Chauvin does not budge, not even an inch, after there's no movement coming from George Floyd whatsoever. Like from the bystander video, you could see the man likely was not breathing. And the paramedics today, one of them said that in layman's terms, he thought George Floyd was dead already. This was before they put him in the ambulance. And if you look closely at the bystander video, what happens is the paramedics walk near where Derek Chauvin had his knee on George Floyd's neck, and Derek Chauvin still does not move on his own. A paramedic literally had to swat him, to nudge him
to get him to move on. He was pretty comfortable.
Floyd's neck, very comfortable. He had his hand in his pocket, a smirk on his face. As the bystanders are yelling at him to get off, he's shaking a little bit. So that to me was diabolical.
How does that play out in the courtroom, though?
Well, it will play out in terms of the medical experts talking about the knee being the cause of death in terms of restricting his airflow and any other injuries they may have witnessed, or how the lack of injury in a certain part of the body may still be indicative of someone's airflow being cut off, for example, as opposed to this notion of a drug overdose or the fact that George Floyd had hypertension, which a lot of Black people do. But that doesn't, mean that you're going to die in your 40s because you have high blood pressure. So it's going to be interesting as that testimony goes forward. But one of the things that it brought to mind for me in terms of watching the bystander video and seeing the paramedics is that they took their sweet time pulling the bed out. It was like in slow motion from my perspective.
It seemed like they thought he was already dead.
Well, that's what they're saying. But if you came to an emergency where they told you that it looks like the person, it's a serious situation, from my perspective, you're going to run over there and assess the scene first and tell Derek Chauvin, get your knee off of his neck. But it took a while for them to even walk over and kind of nudge Derek Chauvin to remove his knee. And why that's important is because too often EMTs and paramedics work hand in hand with the Minneapolis Police Department to oppress the rights of Black people. So, for example, the whole ketamine scandal, where Minneapolis police were urging and pressuring EMTs to give people ketamine, which is a date rape drug, and using a bogus diagnosis called excited delirium as the reason, basically saying people are so agitated that they needed to be given ketamine because they were experiencing excited delirium. That is a bogus diagnosis, but you're going to hear that come up as part of the defense's strategy in this case to argue that George Floyd experienced excited delirium. During that part, when they were trying to get him in the police car and he was agitated and he was saying, I can't breathe, I want to sit in the front seat. I believe that the defense is going to try to use excited delirium as yet another justification for why George Floyd was killed.
So we could do this for hours. I know we're going to still continue to watch the trial as it plays out. But we have a white police officer right now who is on trial for the murder of a Black man, manslaughter for second degree, third degree murder. What is the historical significance of this, and what impact will the outcome, do you think, have either way?
Mm-hmm. Well, in the state of Minnesota, we've never had a white police officer even charged for killing a Black person, let alone convicted.
Right.
So
these are major, second degree, third degree.
Yeah, second degree unintentional murder, second degree manslaughter, and third degree murder. Mm-hmm. So that would be a huge relief to many of us to finally see a white police officer be held accountable for killing a Black body, because up to this point, they have felt very comfortable in being able to take the lives of Black people and get away with it. You know, you can name off many names of people who have been killed since 2013 up to the present, and who are Black, who've been killed at the hands of the police. So that's important. I think that it'll send ripple effects as well to white officers to let them know, you're not above the law, that you can be charged and you can be convicted and you can spend time in prison if you are out here killing people unjustifiably. Now, in the event that Derek Chauvin is acquitted, which is what I think people should also understand could still happen. So I know Mary talked about, she thought that the defense is not doing as well. I'm waiting to see what's going to happen before I make that assessment. Just because of how the system typically works. And I'm hoping, like I said, for a conviction though. But if he's acquitted, I believe that it's going to be an even more dangerous situation for Black people living in the state of Minnesota. Why? Because we saw a video where a white officer was able to press his knee into someone's neck for 9 minutes and 29 seconds over an alleged counterfeit $20 bill. The world saw it. 26 million people took to the streets. 50 million people watched that video. The world saw what happened. And to have Derek Chauvin be able to walk away, that sends a message to officers. There's nothing that you can't do. You're not going to be punished, for whatever you decide to do to people. If we don't see Derek Chauvin being punished in this case for what he did. And if he is acquitted, those other 3 officers are likely not even going to stand trial in August. If the chief, person who is responsible is not held accountable under the law, there's no real reason for state prosecutors to try to ensure a conviction of those other 3 cops. So again, that is very dangerous for us as Black people if that happens. We know that a conviction is not going to ever bring back George Floyd, but just like if any of us go out and commit a heinous crime, we expect to spend time in prison. That's what needs to happen when law enforcement officers violate people's rights and kill civilians. That needs to be the standard, when there's no justification for that, for the use of deadly force.
Thank you. As we get ready to part, what can we do as, in community? Because, we're not on a jury, stand. And some of us feel powerless. We're watching something it almost feels surreal for a lot of us as we're watching, and they're like, oh, this is really happening. What are our takeaways? We get that there's, the prosecution takeaways, the defense takeaways, but for us, what can we do to be empowered? What do we do to change the little pieces that we have in our lives, in our communities right now?
Well, I think one of the most important things that people can do is, especially Black people, right, is make sure that we're taking care of ourselves, right? Just even as simple as trying to get a good night's sleep, getting a good meal, taking a walk, getting a massage. Whatever you need to do for your own self-care needs to be paramount in this situation. I would say do our best to limit exposure to our children regarding this trial, because it is far too much for the average young person to have to deal with. In terms of changing some of the laws and policies, I mentioned before, we have 8 bills pending at the legislature. So if you go to mncoalition.org, that's MN for Minnesota, coalition.org, you will see those bills that are currently being proposed. We need folks to call their legislator and ask them to champion these bills, because we believe that these bills, if they pass, they'll help to transform policing in the state of Minnesota. When we do marches and demonstrations, if you are physically able, come on out and join us. There's strength in numbers, there's solidarity in numbers. And as people on the front lines, we feel a stronger sense of community when people are out there with us. People, when we put out calls to action, to make a phone call, to send an email to an elected official, we're asking people to do that. And then over the long haul, if you have a problem with what you're seeing from our elected officials, and you've tried and they won't listen, consider running for office yourself and getting in those seats and becoming a change agent on behalf of our community. We need support on all those levels. We also need to make sure that people have access to mental health resources in our community care circles. I urge allies, check in on your friends and family members who are Black or people of color and see what they need. See if they need a meal, see if they, whatever they need, just do your best to be open and extend yourself to people, because this is a very trying time for many of us in this community, but we're trying to be strong and resilient in the midst of what is happening here in George Floyd's name and his memory.
Wow. Thank you so much, Nekima. And that's something that I have noticed that has been a blessing for the community at large, that we've been able to come together more intentionally and not just send our thoughts and prayers. Do you know what I mean? It's been more action, and to see even white allies come on and, like folks like Mary to pop on and, to come and step outside of her normal position and come into a place like the Spokesman-Recorder to be able to share her perspective and to give us that legalese and sometimes just the thinking, the mentality behind what's happening, because we're looking at it one way and she's like, well, no, this is their job in a whole different way. And I know you have a legal background as well, but you ain't white. So you don't have the same perspective.
That is for sure.
So this has been really good and eye-opening, I think, for the community. And I'm just looking forward to, those points that you continue to share with us as you go live on your platforms, as you share your pieces for the Minnesota Spokesman-Recorder. And we just continue to watch and stay engaged. And I think that's really what the Spokesman-Recorder is really asking for the community right now, is watch, stay engaged. That we have writers and editors that will cover things, you, Nekima, we have Mary, and then we also have, Mel Reeves, a community editor who's out here, and he's going to be on the front line and still on the front line, continuing his good work too. So that's what we're asking right now for you as a community. Stay involved, stay engaged, stay vocal, and, hold everyone to the fire. Hold the Black press to the fire, hold the white press to the fire, hold everyone to the fire until we get to where we have a place of open dialogue and some sort of equity in our community. So Thank you so much, Nekima.
Thank you for having me. Awesome job.
Awesome. Again, everyone, tune in. We've dropped links in the comments for you, minnesotacoalition.org. Check out the Spokesman for ongoing coverage, and then also CARE as well. So yes, thank you so much. Tune in.